The streets of Los Angeles buzzed with energy, but not for Jake Callahan. He had been walking these streets for what felt like an eternity. His military jacket worn thin from years of use. A patch of faded fabric across his chest held the only reminder of the life he used to have, U.S. Navy SEAL. To anyone else, it was just a relic of a forgotten past. To Jake, it was the only part of himself that still felt like it mattered. His face, lined with stubble, was unreadable as he shuffled down the sidewalk, keeping his head low to avoid the attention he didn't want. The world had long since passed him by. He wasn't someone people stopped for, not anymore. He was just another homeless vet, blending into the city's backdrop, an invisible man lost in a sea of broken lives. Jake stopped at the corner, his worn boots scraping against the pavement as he shuffled closer to the entrance of a convenience store. He pulled the tattered cardboard sign from his bag and leaned it against the wall. "I served. Please help." It wasn't much, but it was all he had left to offer. The city's rhythm carried on as people passed him by, some throwing $1 into his cup, others simply avoiding eye contact. He was used to it. No one cared about the forgotten soldiers, not really. They didn't know what it was like to live through things that should have broken him, and they didn't care to learn. Jake adjusted the sleeves of his jacket and settled against the wall, trying to find a comfortable position. The night was growing colder, and the wind sliced through the alley like a blade. His eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the crowd moving through the streets. It was routine, nothing new, until he saw them. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story." A black van rolled to a slow stop just a few feet away, the tires barely making a sound. Jake had seen enough to know what was coming. He could smell trouble from a mile away. 4 men stepped out of the van, their faces covered by dark balaclavas. They didn't look like the usual street thugs who passed by. They looked like they were on a mission, and Jake Callahan was their target. The first man approached him, his footsteps deliberate and measured. He stopped just a few feet away and crouched down, his eyes narrowing under the mask. Jake didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations, surrounded by enemies who meant to kill him, but he wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to show fear. "Got a problem, old man?" the man asked, his voice cold and menacing. Jake stared at him, the muscles in his shoulders tensing. There was something about the man that didn't sit right, his posture, his confidence. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It felt like a setup. "Yeah," Jake muttered, voice hoarse. "I've got a problem, but it's not yours." Before he could react, a hand grabbed the back of his neck, yanking him forward. A bag was shoved over his head, and he was pulled toward the van. He didn't fight. There was no point. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to drag him into something. He'd been in worse situations, been on the battlefield, been held at gunpoint, but this was different. The calm, methodical way the men moved told him they were professionals. They shoved him into the back of the van, the door slamming shut behind him. Jake's senses immediately went on high alert. He could smell gasoline, the stench of sweat and cheap air fresheners. They'd thrown him in the back with no care, and the van rumbled to life as it started driving off, the engine humming through the quiet night. Inside the van, Jake was bound to a chair with thick ropes. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. He wasn't in a typical hostage scenario. These weren't just random criminals looking for money. No, this felt calculated, a different kind of threat. The van took a sharp turn and slowed, then stopped. The engine was killed, and the sound of voices filled the air. "Get him out," one of them ordered. Jake's hands were free now, but he still didn't move. He knew better than to give them any reason to get aggressive. Instead, he sat still, his body tense, waiting for his moment. He had been in worse positions, faced down enemies with weapons in hand, and walked away without a scratch. He could handle this. The men dragged him out of the van, tossing him onto the cold floor of a dimly lit warehouse. He was shoved into a chair and shackled in place. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and oil. "You're gonna tell us everything," the man who had spoken earlier said, walking toward him. His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of malice in his eyes. "You've got something we want, and you're going to give it to us." Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had been trained for this, trained to stay silent, to remain still, to assess, to wait. He could already tell that these men were dangerous, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The man crouched down in front of him, staring into his eyes. "You were in the military, weren't you? Thought we could use someone like you." Jake didn't say a word, but his lips curled into the faintest of smiles. The man leaned in, getting closer, but Jake's eyes never left his. The man laughed, standing up. "You think you're special? You're just a washed-up old soldier. Nobody cares about you anymore." Jake's heartbeat remained steady. He wasn't here for them. They were just another group of idiots thinking they could push him around. He had been in worse positions, faced down enemies with the intent to kill, and walked away without a scratch. This was going to be no different. He just had to wait. "What you don't know is that you're dealing with someone far beyond what you think," Jake finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying a weight that made the men pause. The cartel leader's expression darkened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake didn't flinch. "You have no idea who you've just kidnapped, and I'm not just some homeless vet. I'm a retired Navy SEAL sniper." For a moment, the room fell silent. The cartel members exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. They had made a serious mistake, but they didn't know it yet. Jake smiled inwardly. They would soon. The room was thick with tension. The men in the warehouse, now realizing they might have made a critical error, shifted nervously. Jake's words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken truth. The silence stretched on as the cartel members exchanged cautious glances, trying to figure out what exactly they were dealing with. One of the men, the largest of the group, stepped forward. He sneered at Jake, trying to maintain his authority, but the fear behind his eyes was palpable. "A retired SEAL? You expect me to believe that?" He scoffed, pacing back and forth. "You're just some old vet who couldn't make it, homeless and forgotten. What's your story, huh?" Jake didn't flinch. He had heard these words countless times before. The world had long since abandoned men like him, forgotten warriors left on the streets to rot. But Jake wasn't a man to be underestimated. He had seen and survived things that would break most people. And now, here he was, in the fight of his life, against men who had no clue what they were up against. "You think I'm just some washed-up soldier?" Jake asked, his voice low but steady. "You have no idea how wrong you are." The leader of the cartel, a man named Carlos, stepped closer. "You're just an old soldier with nothing left. But we can use you," he said, trying to sound confident, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his doubt. "Tell us what you know. Tell us who you worked for." Jake remained silent. He didn't need to explain himself to these men. Their time was coming, whether they realized it or not. Carlos leaned in, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "I think you'll talk eventually. All it takes is a little persuasion." But Jake wasn't going to make it easy for him. He had been trained for far worse: torture, isolation, betrayal. But there was one thing he knew better than anyone else: patience. His training had taught him to endure, to stay calm and wait for the right moment. And this moment, this very room, was about to be his. Carlos signaled to his men, and the sound of footsteps echoed as they began to move in closer. But just as the men began to encircle Jake, something in the way he moved caught their attention. It was subtle, a slight shift in his posture, the faintest flicker of a smile that suggested he had something planned. They hesitated for a second, unsure of how to proceed. The first mistake they made was underestimating him. The second mistake was thinking they had time. Before they could react, Jake moved. He was out of the chair in an instant, his hands breaking free from the shackles with a practiced twist that no one saw coming. One of the cartel men lunged toward him, but Jake's fist collided with his face with the force of a battering ram, knocking him to the floor before he could even blink. The other men scrambled to pull out their guns, but it was too late. Jake was already moving like lightning, taking down the nearest man with a swift elbow to the throat, followed by a sharp kick to the stomach. The sound of bone crunching was the only thing that registered as the men staggered back in shock. Carlos's eyes widened in disbelief. He hadn't expected this. He thought he was dealing with some weak, broken man, easy prey. But Jake was far from broken. He was a killing machine, a man trained to survive in the most impossible situations. And this warehouse, this room full of cartel members, was about to be his proving ground. In the chaos, one of the men managed to pull a gun, but Jake was quicker. He disarmed the attacker with a move that was so smooth, so precise, that the man didn't even know what hit him until the barrel of the gun was pressed to his own temple. Carlos shouted, trying to regain control, but it was too late. Jake had already neutralized his men with surgical precision. Carlos took a step back, his fear now palpable. The tables had turned. "You made a big mistake," Jake said, his voice cold and commanding. He pushed the man back against the wall, the barrel of the gun still aimed at his chest. "You thought I was just a homeless man, but I've killed men like you before, and I'll do it again if you don't start talking." Carlos swallowed hard, his bravado gone. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice shaking. "We'll kill you, all of us. You're nothing." Jake's grip tightened on the gun, his eyes narrowing. "You're not listening. The only thing that matters right now is your survival. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to get on the phone, call your boss, and tell him that you've made a huge mistake. You can tell him all about the old homeless vet you tried to mess with. You can tell him you're still alive, but only because I let you." Carlos's face paled. He knew he had no choice but to comply. He had underestimated Jake, thought he was just another weak link in the chain. But now he understood that Jake wasn't someone who could be controlled or dismissed. He was a force to be reckoned with. Jake lowered the gun, stepping back. "Make the call," he said, "and make it quick." Carlos hesitated for a moment longer before he turned, his hands shaking as he dialed the number. Jake watched, his eyes never leaving him. The danger was far from over, but for the first time in this entire ordeal, Jake was in control. The cartel had made the mistake of thinking he was just another forgotten soldier. They thought they could kidnap him, break him, use him. They thought he was weak. They were wrong. He was about to show them just how wrong they were. Carlos's fingers trembled as he held the phone to his ear, listening to the line ring. Jake kept his eyes locked on him, his grip still steady on the gun. The cartel leader had started to sweat, his previous bravado now completely wiped away. Jake had expected the phone call to go one of two ways. Either Carlos would try to bluff his way out of it, or he would comply. Either way, Jake was ready. Finally, the line picked up, and Carlos spoke quickly in rapid Spanish, his voice tight. Jake didn't understand the exact words, but he didn't need to. The tone of the conversation told him everything he needed to know. Carlos was begging for a way out, trying to save face, trying to make it clear that this was a misunderstanding. "Tell him the truth," Jake said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. He wasn't going to let Carlos play games with him. "Tell him you tried to kidnap a retired Navy SEAL sniper, and that it's only by my grace that you're still breathing." Carlos's eyes widened in fear. For a moment he hesitated, then quickly mumbled something into the phone. His face twisted in frustration, but Jake didn't care. He was running the show now. The power had shifted from the cartel to him. "Good," Jake said, his voice low and controlled. "Now you're going to listen to me. I'm going to let you go, but not because you deserve it, not because you've earned it. I'm doing it because you're a liability. You've made your choice, and now you'll get to live with it." Carlos started to speak, his voice pleading. "Please, you don't understand." "I understand everything," Jake interrupted. "You're not going to mess with me, and you're not going to mess with anyone else. You've crossed the line, and now I'm finishing this." The sound of a door creaking in the distance interrupted their conversation. Jake's head snapped to the side, and instinctively, his hand tightened around the gun. More cartel members. The men had probably been outside waiting for Carlos's signal. He had to move quickly. "Get on the ground, Carlos," Jake commanded. "Now." Carlos dropped to the floor without a word, a look of panic in his eyes. Jake quickly scanned the room, weighing his options. He wasn't done yet. There was still too much to do. The sounds of footsteps grew louder. They were closing in, but Jake was already thinking ahead. He knew how this would play out. The only way to get out of here alive was to make sure he controlled the situation until the very end. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and 3 more cartel members stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. They froze when they saw Carlos kneeling on the floor, hands raised above his head. And in the same instant, they spotted Jake, standing with his gun raised, an unyielding presence in the room. There was no hesitation. The moment they saw him, they reached for their guns, but Jake was already moving. His body reacted before his mind even had a chance to process. In a blink, he was in motion, taking out the closest man with a single blow to the throat. The second man went down just as quickly, his gun slipping from his fingers as Jake disarmed him in a swift motion, using the man's momentum against him. The third man tried to raise his gun, but it was too late. Jake had already moved into position, his legs sweeping the man's feet out from under him and knocking him unconscious in seconds. The room was silent once more, except for the soft whimpering of Carlos, who was still kneeling on the floor, too terrified to move. Jake stepped forward, the gun in his hand steady, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't finished yet. There was still more to do. More men, more enemies to eliminate. The cartel had no idea who they were dealing with. "You're done," Jake said, his voice cold and final. "This ends now." Carlos didn't respond, his body shaking with fear. He knew the power had shifted entirely in Jake's favor. What had started as a simple kidnapping had turned into a nightmare that he couldn't control. Jake looked around the warehouse, scanning for any other threats. It was empty now. He had taken care of the immediate danger. But the cartel's reach was vast, and Jake knew that no matter how many men he took out, there would always be more lurking in the shadows. Jake was done running, done hiding. The tables had turned, and he had finally regained control. "You're not getting out of this, Carlos," Jake said, his voice a low growl. "The cartel's done. You'll tell them that. You'll tell them you tried to mess with someone who's not just some homeless veteran. You'll tell them they made a mistake they won't survive." Carlos nodded quickly, his eyes darting around the room. I'll tell them everything, please," he stammered, his voice desperate. "Just don't kill me. Please." Jake looked at him with cold eyes. He had no sympathy left. The world had shown him no mercy. He wasn't about to show any to these men. "I'm not going to kill you," Jake said, his voice flat. "But I'm going to leave you here to think about how badly you messed up. You'll be lucky if your cartel leader takes you back." With that, Jake turned and walked toward the exit of the warehouse. He could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he felt alive. He had regained control, and the world wasn't going to forget about him again. As he stepped into the night, the cool air hitting his face, he felt like a part of him was coming back to life. The man who had once been lost in the streets, forgotten by everyone, was no longer invisible. He had a mission now, a purpose, and there was nothing that could stop him. The cool night air hit Jake's face as he stepped out into the shadows, his boots tapping lightly on the cracked pavement. He didn't look back at the warehouse, knowing the men he left behind were in no position to follow him. His mission here was done, but the thought of what would come next lingered in his mind. The cartel's network was vast, and though tonight had been a victory, he knew it wouldn't be the last time they came for him. This was only the beginning. He moved quickly through the dark streets, the noise of the city still alive behind him, but fading with every step. The world had tried to forget him, treated him like just another casualty, another broken man. But Jake wasn't done. He had a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it, not after everything he had sacrificed. As he walked, he couldn't help but replay the events of the night in his head, the way the cartel had underestimated him, the fear in their eyes when they realized who they were really dealing with. Retired Navy SEAL Sniper, a title that no one would have guessed when they saw him sitting on the streets asking for change. But that was the thing about the world. It was full of people who thought they knew your story without ever asking the right questions. Jake had learned the hard way that people didn't see you for who you were. They only saw what they wanted to see. They thought the old vet was a homeless man. They thought he was weak. They couldn't have been more wrong. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, trying to ward off the cold. But it was a small thing. The world was cold, and it had always been. But tonight, he had reminded himself, and the cartel, that he wasn't the one who should be underestimated. He wasn't just some has-been soldier. He was a force in his own right, and the world was about to remember that. As Jake rounded a corner, he saw a familiar face in the distance, a figure standing by the entrance of a diner. Tom, one of the men he had helped just weeks ago. The former homeless vet who had been skeptical at first, but now had a job, a place to live, a new life. "Hey, Jake!" Tom called out, his voice warm and welcoming. Jake stopped in his tracks, surprised to see him there. Tom wasn't alone. A few others stood nearby, veterans who had been through the same struggles, men who had once been lost, but were now finding their way out of the darkness. "I heard what you did tonight," Tom said, his voice filled with admiration. "You showed them all." Jake didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, taking in the sight of these men, his men. They had taken that first step, just like he had. And now, they were starting to rebuild their lives. Tom stepped closer, clapping a hand on Jake's shoulder. I knew you were more than just some homeless guy. You've been through hell, and now you're showing the rest of us how to fight back. Jake's eyes softened. This was why he had fought so hard, why he had pushed through the years of pain, the loss, the silent suffering that no one else could see. This was the payoff, watching these men stand tall, finding their strength again. I didn't do it for the glory, Jake said quietly. I did it because I can't stand seeing others fall through the cracks. We've all been through too much to just fade away. Tom nodded, his expression serious. And now, we're not going anywhere. We're staying. We're fighting back too. Jake gave him a small smile. Yeah, we are. As the group gathered around him, Jake realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them, about showing the world that no one could be written off. He wasn't the only one with a story to tell. The men around him had their own battles, their own journeys, and together, they were stronger than any cartel or system that tried to tear them down. The sound of a car engine hummed in the distance, but it didn't scare Jake anymore. He wasn't running from anything. The world had tried to break him, but here he was, still standing, still breathing. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him. Hope. It was a quiet, steady force, the kind that didn't come from the promise of easy victories, but from the certainty that you could fight and survive, even when the odds were stacked against you. And so, as the men around him laughed and joked, the world outside seemed a little less cold, a little less empty. Jake Callahan had been forgotten by most, but the ones who mattered, his brothers, had found him again. And that was all that mattered now.